Alright, well, the first track that I'm going to talk to you about was my track emulating the producer Moby. And before we get into it, I'd like to talk about sort of the concept of creativity. So, there's a woman by the name of Margaret Bowden who has some pretty interesting concepts on what creativity means and how it can be used. And I thought it was quite fascinating and worth discussing with Moby's tracks. So part of her sort of philosophy is that there are three main types of creativity, and that there's sort of varying levels of creativity. So the first level she describes as combinational, which is finding two things that sort of aren't traditionally put together and then putting them together to create something new. The second type is exploratory, that's right. The second kind is exploratory creativity, which sort of puts you into a different mind frame, or something completely new that could not have been previously conceived. So it's something that hasn't existed yet. And then the final form, and the most sort of experimental, sort of purer form of creativity, I guess you'd say, is called transformational creativity. And that is when you completely change how something is supposed to happen. So, for instance, Picasso with his cubism style paintings, and to put that in a musical context, it'd be like using an instrument in a way that it was not meant to be used. Say you threw a guitar out of a window and recorded that sound and used that in a song. So that's just sort of where I started with the Moby thing, was trying to sort of discover his creative mind frame. And obviously the main thing that he does in the Play album is finding older style vocals from old blues and folk albums, and then making them into something modern by adding modern instruments, and sort of giving traction to a voice of the past, something that would never have been heard by anyone, is now, can be quite impactful on people. So without further ado, we'll get into the logic session of what I came up with. So I'll show you how I first started the track. I found this old blues vocal, much like Moby did, basically.
No more, my love. No more, my love. Lord, I'll never turn back. No more, no more, no more.
So that track originally was not recorded in any kind of timing. So I use Logic's flex function here, and all you need to do is, I went rhythmic. There are other styles of it which can be more useful in certain situations, but all I had to do here was find a tempo that I was happy with, which, although it says that, it's actually 88 beats per minute, and then from there Logic will automatically analyze this data when you go to rhythmic, and from here I can drag all of this back and forth so that it's in time with the track, which is very handy. From there I got rid of some of the low end sort of muddy noise that was in the background of the track, and I also cut out, when I was editing this, there was sort of a drum hit in between the vocals that I got rid of. I also compressed the vocals just in order to bring up some of the quieter parts. So later on in the track especially, it's compressed quite heavily. The threshold's quite low, just because there were a lot of sort of quieter parts along here that I wanted to bring out. So from there, the next thing I did was wrote a piano line, which is this line here. And that more or less follows the vocals, so that sort of introduces itself as a one-note thing, and then it adds an octave a bit later on just for a little bit extra oomph. So that is just using the Steinway grand piano, which is available in Logic. Logic's instruments I find are quite useful compared to other workstations. Their instruments, the sort of catalogue of instruments is quite large, and they actually sound really good. So what I did here is I EQ'd out a lot of the low end and made it a bit brighter on the top end, just for my preference of sound. I also compressed it to get rid of a lot of the attack on the piano, and also in the instrument itself I dragged the attack up a wee bit just to make it not so harsh on your ears, sort of, with those stabbing notes. I also side-chained a compressor to the vocal track, and what this does is it ducks the volume of the piano while the vocals are playing, and because they're sort of occupying that mid-range of the EQ frequency range, they can kind of clash. So having the piano duck out when the vocals are in makes it just makes space for the vocals, really. And I also added a chorus plugin, which on Logic, if you turn the rate down to 0, it doesn't modulate the sound at all other than the panning. So it does sort of a stereo spread, and then you just set the intensity in the mix, and it will spread it out for you so that it creates space in the mix. And I also sent a lot of the piano to the standard reverb that comes up, which is this one here, and that's the one that just comes up factory with Logic. So from there, what I did was I had this organ come in just to give it a bit more soul, a bit more feel. So I'll play this for you. And what those are all just triad chords in the key of C sharp minor, following the vocals. So a triad chord with obviously the bass note there as well. Not inverted or anything, just sort of standard triads. So again, on this I added the chorus, but this time I had a slight bit of modulation, just to sort of give it a bit of movement, so it's not so stale for the entire track, because as you can see it goes through most of the track. After this I got the drums going. So this was probably one of the most fun parts of the track. Is I went on, there's a website called splice.com, and I'll show you this, guys, because it's super handy. So what it is it's a monthly subscription type site. As you click on sounds and then you just search whatever you want, and it's got hundreds of thousands of samples that you can download. It's got let's have a look. Say if I type in snare, it's got 140,000 results there. So obviously there's a lot that you can choose from, and you can categorize it. You can go for loops, one shots, you can set the BPM for the loops, the key, which is obviously more useful with other instruments, but yeah, there's all sorts of things, and this is where I found all of my drum samples for this track. So what I did is I just went for sort of, I went genre, I went hip hop, I went soul, instruments, obviously I went drums, and then BPM, because it's 86 BPM, I set it between 80 and 90. And my reasoning for this is because if you get something that's way too out of time with the track and then you make it the same time, it can just ruin the sound. So I'm a big fan of Ableton's use of changing So I'm a big fan of using Ableton to change the key and also the tempo of samples. Logic does have these functions, but I find that it's much more time consuming, and it doesn't completely ruin it, but after a while it just damages the sound of the sample. So yeah, basically I'll show you how I did this. So the samples are missing. I'll get into the reasons for that in my next video. But basically all I had to do is I dragged every single sample here into the individual tracks, and then all I had to do is double click the sample, and Ableton automatically down here will guess what tempo that sample is at. And for every single sample on here, it did it completely accurately. So as you can see, they're labeled, this one's 100, this one's 90, and that's how they're labeled coming off of splice.com, but Ableton was able to accurately do it every single time. And then what it automatically does is it'll play back those samples at whatever tempo you set up here. And as you can see, I've set it to 88, which was the beats per minute for my Moby track. So then I just export each of these individually at their new tempos, which will match, and then all I have to do is drag them into Logic and they're perfect. So I have sort of three main beats. So this is the main beat for a lot of the track. Along with this. And that obviously provides a lot more bass. I've got an EQ on there as well. I had a build up at the start, and I heavily compressed that build up because the original sample, the kick drum is much louder than anything else, and all you can pretty much hear is a kick drum, so that's my reasoning for compressing that, was to bring up a lot of the other drum sounds. When it gets to a bit more movement in the track, I add this pocket track. And that just adds a bit of kick and snare, a bit more power. And also, to gain some more movement and just something a bit different, there's this track which relies heavily on the ride. And obviously I've EQ'd out a lot of the kick here just because the other tracks are already providing enough and didn't really need any more. And then I have these fill tracks which come in. And they're sort of at transitional times, and all I need to do is drop out one of the tracks. As you can see, I've dropped out this one here, I've dropped out this one here, just when the fills come in, just to provide space for them without creating too much noise. And sort of one thing that it was lacking was being loops. I mean, there's not a huge amount of variety, so what I decided to add in were some hits. So I've got these hits here, and they are just using the Detroit Garage kit that's available on Logic. And it's quite important when you're doing drums like this and mixing a bunch of different drum kits to try and make it sound cohesive and not all over the place. So what I've done to combat that is summed them all up into this bus, and the easiest way to do that is you highlight everything, you go control click or right click, and then all you need to do is go create track stack. I've already done it for these, I believe. Oh, it's usually there, but obviously I've already done it. So you click on that, then you go summing stack, and it will sum it into a handy folder like this, and it will also create a bus track, which those are all automatically sent to. So what I've done to make it more cohesive is I've compressed all those drums together, so they're the same volume, they're running through the same compressor, and also sent them all to the exact same track here for reverb, and that obviously makes the drums sound like they are in the same room as each other, which just makes it a better, more cohesive sound. So one of the final things I did was this piano track here, which is very much in the style of Moby. And again, I'm running the same channel strip that I did on the first piano, so it's essentially the same instrument. It's sidechain compression, it's spread out the same way, same EQ, and the way you do that is you just control click here, go copy channel strip setting, then go to wherever you want to put it, and you just go paste channel strip setting, and it'll copy all the plugins exactly, which will save you a lot of time. Then the final thing I did for this track is the bass recording. So I recorded this on a live bass, just using the DI, direct instrument input for the bass into a test cam interface, and that's what this sounds like. So I got rid of some unwanted harmonics in this EQ, and also dropped out a lot of the muddy bass before sort of affecting the fundamental frequency of the sound. I also compressed it because my bass playing is not the best, and that just brought out the notes that I didn't play as hard, sort of brought them up to the level of the louder ones. I also put another EQ in there, just where the fundamental frequency of the bass is, really just to give it a bit more oomph. And I also added an exciter, just to try and discover some interesting harmonics. Because I'd gotten rid of the unwanted ones, I thought I'd try and bring back some of the sounds that I might want. Now finally, what I'll discuss with you for this track are these last two. So in order to preserve the sound of this vocal, I almost just kept a lot of the artifacts and a lot of the imperfections, so you'll be able to hear sort of in this area where it just goes quiet, you'll be able to hear a lot of cracking and spitting, and that's due to the original recording being poor, basically. And also the way I've edited it, I haven't had fade-ins and fade-outs on these little bits, which is traditional, but as I said, I was trying to preserve sort of the old style sound, bad recording type thing. So I added this vinyl crackle track down here, purely because when I solo this, when the vocals stop, it just goes absolutely silent. And that just sounds unnatural and not proper. So what I've done is added this vinyl track just to give it some ambience, so that there's something going on when the vocals go silent. And I also added this white noise track. And it is very quiet, but in the final mix you can hear it. and I side-chained it, so basically it only plays when the vocals duck out. And that just gives it sort of, that ambient sound, so that there's at least something going on when it goes completely silent. And then again, when it's just the vocals playing, I bring it back a bit later on in the track. So I sort of kept with the structure of Moby songs as very basic verse, chorus, with some sort of dance break style things. And around 3 minutes and 30 seconds long. Or just over 3 minutes and 30 seconds, which is pretty standard for a Moby track. And then what I also did is I actually dragged in this track here, which is one of Moby's tracks. And my reasoning for this is what I can do is what I have to do, you turn off the plugins for the stereo channel because you don't want it to be affecting the mix. And what you do is you can play it, and then you can mute it, turn those back on so you can hear your track the way it was intended to be. And then you can just compare the EQ levels, the volumes, you can compare basically everything, and make it sound exactly like what you want it to sound like. And another way of doing this is by going into the EQ for the stereo output, turn on the analyzer, and then you get a perfect visual of the frequency ranges that you're trying to hit. And that was the perfect way to sort of finish off the track. And I also put a limiter on the final track, which just helped me during mixing, so that nothing was peaking or anything like that. That's more or less the entire Moby track. So overall I'm very happy with that Moby track. I believe that I was able to emulate the producer very well. I was able to practice a lot of skills. For instance, just making something completely from nothing, finding an old track and making it modern, making it fit into sort of a modern setting better, where a new generation of people can listen to it. That's probably the most important thing that I took from this is the different ways of creativity, and doing that and sort of recycling things. And also just the possibility that you can make a satisfactory track, like you can make a really good sounding track without recording much at all. I mean, the majority of what I used on this was all samples that I found online and all Logic instruments. The only thing I recorded myself was the bass guitar, and I mean, I think overall it sounds great. I would highly recommend using splice.com. Get on there. It's only like $10 a month or something ridiculous like that, and you've just got unlimited sounds that you can get. I've found it so handy with pretty much everything I do. If you need any sound, you just jump on there and you find it within 30 seconds. You find the perfect sound that you're after. I mixed this track both in headphones and using the KRK Rocket 6s, which are quite a bassy style of speaker, but it's sort of ideal for this kind of music, because it is sort of based in dance music, I suppose you'd call it.